Hey everyone, and welcome to the Retro channel. Previously, we looked at HDMI output for the Commodore 64. That included both audio and video over a single HDMI cable. Well, today we're doing the same for the VIC-20. This is going to be a little bit different. Obviously, it's not going to involve the Quarry because there is no such thing for the VIC-20, but it will give us the same result: digital video and audio over HDMI from a VIC-20. So let's get into it, see what we need to do. Now, before we begin looking at the parts required, I want to give a quick shout out to Darren Johnston, who recently joined the Captain Blood tier on Patreon. So thank you, Darren. Thank you to all my patrons who support the channel. I certainly wouldn't have made it this far without you guys. So I really do appreciate all the support that you give. Let's take a look at the parts required. So first up, we're going to need a SideKick64. As the name suggests, this is primarily designed for the Commodore 64, but it also functions with the VIC-20 and the 264 or TED series of computers. For the Commodore 64, this can provide freezer cartridge functions and loading programs, emulated SIDs, all that kind of goodness. But for the VIC-20, it provides HDMI output along with memory expansions and also loading programs. So that's the first thing that's going to be required. We'll go into where to find this in a minute. The other thing we're going to need is a Raspberry Pi 3A Plus or 3B Plus, or potentially a Raspberry Pi 02. That's because the SideKick relies on a Raspberry Pi to do the heavy lifting. So in this case, I already had a 3A Plus lying around that I wasn't using, so that's what I'm going to be using for this build. But as I mentioned, a 3B Plus or a 02 may work as well. The 02 requires some heavy overclocking, so maybe best to stick to a 3A or a 3B plus. We're going to need this adapter, which is going to plug into the VIC-20 cartridge port, and with the help of this female 44-pin edge connector, that's going to allow us to plug in the SideKick. We're also going to need a little bit of wire. I've chosen a piece with a female DuPont connector on the end here. The male end doesn't matter, I'm going to cut this off anyway, but something around 15 centimeters in length should be fine. Maybe 20 centimeters is even better. And we're also going to need a little right angle male pin header. This is going to obviously plug into this guy right here. And I've just realized there's something wrong with this female connector, so I'll swap that out for another one, which actually grabs onto the pin. That's better. So those two. And finally, we're going to need 7 diodes. These are 1N4148s. Nothing particularly special about them. They're pretty commonplace. And we're also going to need 2 10K resistors. Again, nothing special about these. They're just standard quarter watt 10K resistors. Now, we'll put a link below to where you can find these edge connectors. I got these ones off AliExpress. I'm sure you can find them on Mouser and DigiKey, that kind of thing, but they're probably going to be 5 times the price. I'm sure these, they look half decent, so I'm sure they're going to be just fine. As for these 2 items, we're going to have a look at the SideKick GitHub. This is the GitHub page for the SideKick64. It's a project by Frenetic, and there are a couple of ways to obtain one of these. Obviously, it's open source, so you can build your own. Otherwise, you can find a seller that potentially has some in stock. There is Restore Store in Germany who was stocking them. Looks like they're currently out of stock at the moment, but maybe they'll get some more back in. I also found someone on Amubay who appears to be selling them. I'll put a link to this in the description down below. I'm not affiliated with either of these places, so it's totally up to you which one you go with. Otherwise, the Gerbers are available if you want to build your own, so we're going to need to head into the Gerber folder anyway, because we'll need to grab this SideKick SK20 adapter. This is this thing right here. Now, I went for the horizontal version, but there is also a vertical version available, which is pretty much going to mount the SideKick up this way. Personally, I didn't really want to go for that because I just don't want this thing flopping around. I'd rather have it horizontal, and I think that'll put less stress on the actual connections. So either way, we're going to need the adapter, so let's download that. And if you're going to build your own SideKick, you've either got the option of the standard one, or there's the one that fits the Pi 02. Now, they technically both fit either Pis. The difference is the Pi 02 one is slightly smaller, so it fits the Pi 02 better, but you can use either Pi with either SideKick. So if you're going to be building your own, you want to grab one of those as well. While you're in there, you can even grab the C16 or the 264 series adapter. I'm not going to be doing that today, but I do have a Commodore 16 here that I haven't looked at yet, so maybe that'll be something we'll look at in the future. Of course, if you're building your own SideKick, you're going to need to source all the components as well. All that information is present in the GitHub page. So now we have the Gerbers, it's time to get these PCBs fabricated, and for that I'm going to use our channel sponsor, PCBWay. Ordering from these guys is super simple. You just go to PCB Instant Quote and you can find this quick order PCB. From there you can add your Gerber files. So let's add the adapter, and just like that it'll give you a preview of it. Sometimes the preview is a little bit broken, so you can see that it doesn't look quite right as compared to this thing. But that's not a big deal. The guys at PCBWay will check over the Gerber files, make sure everything's right before they go actually making the board. So not a big deal. Sometimes the preview just doesn't look completely accurate. You can also go into their online Gerber viewer and look at it in there. Usually it looks correct on that. So don't worry too much about that. We don't really need to change any of these options unless you want to order more than 5. You can order 10,000 of them if you want. And all of this stuff can be left the same. I do really like the idea of the matte black, but it is a little bit more expensive. So pick your color, save to cart, and then from there, you'll obviously need to sign in or create an account. But after that, the checkout process is very simple. I do have a link below to get $5 off your first order if you're a new customer. So check that out if you haven't ordered from them in the past. And before you know it, a box will arrive from PCBWay with your PCBs. Beautiful. So let's get into how to build this adapter. I've obviously already got a pre-assembled SideKick, so I'm not going to be showing how to build one of those today. But the adapter is pretty straightforward and requires only basic soldering skills, so let's stick to that. Let's just start off with the diodes. So you'll notice that there is a stripe on one end of the diode, which indicates the cathode end. And looking closely at the PCB, there is a stripe towards the bottom here. So our diodes want to go around that way. So I'm just using my little lead forming tool. This thing is, I think, from the 80s, and I don't think you're going to be able to find one easily these days. But you can 3D print a little lead former. It looks like a little ruler that sort of tapers. Those things look to work perfectly fine. I just like to use this tool because I've got it, so why not? Oh, and I just noticed there's spots for SMD components on here, so you could also put SMD size stuff on here. I'm just going to stick with through hole for now. That's all our components just placed in the board. Before I go soldering them in, we just want to make sure that the black stripe on the diodes is facing towards the VIC-20 side, which it looks to be on all of these, so let's get to soldering. Alrighty. Cool, that's all those soldered in place. Let's get this edge connector soldered onto the board. Now there is a bit of a gap between the pins here, so we do need to sort of just bend these in towards each other. Did require a good amount of force, but yes, they did all bend in pretty evenly by the looks of it. Now we just do the other side. All right, so they're almost touching. That's pretty much what we want to see because we're just going to slide this through here. Right, that may be a little bit too close together, so I'm just going to bend one side back out a little bit. All right, let's see how that goes. Cool, that seems better. So it is just grabbing the board a little bit. We can still move it around, but once we solder this in place, it should provide a good secure connection. So I'm just going to come in with the soldering iron and just touch the pad and this pin at the same time, and then stick some solder in from the side. And I'll do the same for this end. Flip the board and do the same for the other two corners. Feels good. Cool. Then we just fill in the rest. All right, ignoring the little bit of flux residue, that all looks pretty good. I'm very happy with those joints. Now, one more thing that we'll need to solder is this right angle pin header. This actually goes on the board at the in1 spot. So that sits there somewhere. And then this wire actually needs to run inside the VIC-20 because it needs to attach to address line 15, which isn't available on the cartridge port. So we're going to need to sort that out. So I won't solder that in place until we figure out how to route this wire. Now, if you're not looking for HDMI output from the VIC-20, you can actually connect this up as it is. You don't need to attach that extra address line. This will work for the VIC-20 and give us RAM expansion and also cartridge and program loading, but it's not going to give us the VIC-20 HDMI output. So maybe it's a good idea if we just do a quick test with this, just to make sure the SideKick64 and this adapter is working with our VIC-20. So the SideKick64 is going to plug into the Raspberry Pi going this way. And then this is going to plug into here. And then that's going to plug into the VIC-20. Of course, before we do anything, we need to prep the micro SD card for the Raspberry Pi. So back over on the SideKick GitHub page, we need to go to Releases and just download the latest release file. Once you've got that, you simply want to extract all to your memory card, which in this case is drive E for me. This is just a FAT32 formatted, I think it's a 32 gig SD card. The next thing we need to do before we can put it in the Raspberry Pi is head into the config file, and we want to scroll down to where we find SideKick for the VIC-20 and uncomment one of these lines. Now, it's recommended that we use the include SideKick20 RPI 0, even though we're running it on a Raspberry Pi 3A. That shouldn't matter. It just sets up a little bit of the frequencies for the Raspberry Pi. So I've uncommented that line and just saved the file. Now we can put this into the Raspberry Pi and test this out. So we'll stick that in the Raspberry Pi. We also just need to make sure that these jumpers are correct. So this jumper up here should be set to A13, which it is. And this jumper here should be on the left, which is set to D0. Let's plug that in, power on the Raspberry Pi by just connecting power. And we've got some lights and SideKick20. I don't know why it's on its side like that. Normally with the 64 version, that's horizontal, but this is on the side. I don't know. Let's power this on and see if it works. Yes, there we go. SideKick20. So at the moment, the menu looks pretty basic and the composite video, like I said, isn't great. We can just run A, which should run this program Hello World. That looks to be working. And on the SideKick itself, there's 3 buttons up here. One of them is just a reset button. The other one, I think, only works on the 64, so it doesn't do anything on the VIC-20. And the final button should bring us back into the menu, which it does. There's also a cartridge test program, so we can hit 1 to run that. And yep, everything appears to be working. So the SideKick is working. Now all we need to do is hook up that extra address line using this wire and our little pin header. All right, here we go inside the VIC-20. I'll just disconnect the power LED for a minute. So the pin we need to tap from is pin 25 on the CPU. So that's going to be 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. So our wire needs to get from there out through here somewhere. So the bit of wire I've got is not that long, so I'm just going to see if there's a better place to find this signal, maybe on one of these ICs up here. So 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, let's see. Oh. So it is on the 3rd pin of UC5. It's on the 6th pin of UC6, so that might be ideal. Yep, okay. Pin 6 of UC6, I think, is where I'm going to grab this from. Just throw a tiny bit of flux on there. All right, that seems pretty solid. It's just no clean flux, but I'll just wipe it off the top of this IC. Okay. So we want to route this out through the cartridge port somewhere without actually blocking regular cartridges. So I'm thinking around the outside in between the case here. And there's actually a hole in the cartridge port here, which we can potentially tie this wire to. I'm just going to have a little bit of slack there, and then I'm going to stick a little cable tie through that hole in the cartridge port. Tie that up and try and get it as tight as possible. Right, and that's just going to stop this from being able to get pulled off this chip here. Seems pretty good. So our cable tie is just in place through that little hole in the cartridge shield, and yeah, it seems to provide a decent amount of strain relief. Close this up, make sure it all fits back together. Cool, so we've just got a wire sticking out here. Obviously it's a female connector, so it's not going to short out to anything in there. And I guess you can always kind of tuck it back in the case if it gets annoying. So because it's coming from this side, I think I'll put our pin header facing that way. Cool, so that's just installed in the position that says in 1. Let me just close up this VIC-20 case again. And now we should be able to plug this back into here. Plug this back into the VIC-20 cartridge port. And our little connector, probably should have connected that before I plugged it all back in. It's okay, we can just get to it. There we go, that's it. All right, cool. The SideKick still seems to be working. We just need to change one more thing on the micro SD card just to enable HDMI output. So let's grab the SD card again. I'll just unplug this, get that out. And with the micro SD card back on the computer, we just need to head into the VIC-20 or VC-20 folder and open up the SideKick20 CFG file. You'll find these lines here which relate to the VIC emulation. So for this system, it is a PAL machine, so I'm going to change that to PAL. Otherwise, you'd change it to NTSC if you're running an NTSC system. Hit save, close that, put the micro SD back in the Raspberry Pi. Right, everything here looks normal. It should still output a composite video signal because it is still using the VIC that's inside the VIC-20 to generate the video and audio, but it's also emulating the VIC with the Raspberry Pi. So the HDMI output from the Raspberry Pi should give us the exact same thing that we're seeing on the screen here, just in HDMI crystal clear goodness. There is, of course, only one way to find out. Let's switch over to HDMI. So HDMI from the Pi is going into this thing. And there we go. The SideKick20 in a very, sharp looking image. Let's exit out to basic. And there we are. So it's not scaled right at the moment, but it is, very clean. So according to my little display, we're getting 576p at 50 Hertz. Let me just see if I can bring this out a little bit more. All right, that's about as much as I can scale it on this little screen, but there might be further setup options that we can look at. I think we should plug this directly into a HDMI capture device and check it out on that. Okay, so here we are with a direct capture, and as you can see, everything looks very clean, very sharp. The problem I found though is with my particular capture device. My EVGA XR1 Lite does not like this audio output from the Raspberry Pi. Now, I did get in touch with the GitHub owner and developer of this project, Frenetic, and he did mention that audio might not work with all devices, and it seems this is one of them. Surprisingly enough, my very cheap USB to HDMI capture device does accept the audio, so we're going to use that, but it will look a little bit softer using this thing. It's not the greatest capture device in the world. So just like the Quarry for the C64, the HDMI from this can be a little bit hit and miss. Thankfully, the plasma display that I've got in this room did actually handle the audio and video perfectly fine, but running it through the AV receiver that I normally have hooked up to that TV resulted in no audio. So again, audio not 100% guaranteed. Anyway, let's keep looking at what else this thing can do. So if we back out to the menu again and jump into basic, you can see that we've got 3583 bytes free. Now it is very easy to change the memory settings. There's a menu in the SideKick, so you can enable all of those. That will give you the full 35K RAM expansion. Obviously, it only says 28159 on the basic screen though. The other thing you can do is load up, obviously, larger games that require the 35K. So for example, Help Bodge is a new game that requires 35K and it loads up perfectly fine with the SideKick. You can force different memory configurations. Usually it's just set to auto for the SideKick, so when you load up a program, it'll automatically try and determine how much RAM is needed. And for me, that seems to have worked pretty well. One last thing I did find was with the display, you can actually have that rotated the right way. So if I just power everything off and heading back into the VIC-20 folder on the memory card and the SideKick20 CFG file, there is an option here to have the display not rotated. So I just need to delete that little bit. That should fix that up. There are other options in here that you can play with. I'm not going to go through what all of those do because I don't know what half of them do, but it does look to be pretty well documented. So yeah, feel free to play around with those. You can also enable VFLI mode for the emulated VIC-20, so just the HDMI output. This is like a new set of screen modes for the VIC-20, but it does require some pretty significant hardware modifications usually. But with the SideKick64, you just enable the option and it's ready to go. And here's a quick sample of the VFLI mode. So I think it's 16 colors and, I don't know, the highest possible resolution that the VIC-20 can put out. So aside from the hit and miss audio compatibility, I think this is a pretty good solution if you want HDMI from the original VIC-20. The screen scaling doesn't always take up the whole screen, so you may have to zoom it out on your display. But overall, I think it's a pretty neat solution to get HDMI from a VIC-20, especially considering what the original video quality of this thing looks like. There's probably some other functions with the SideKick and the VIC-20 that I haven't looked at yet, so be sure to check the GitHub page for those kind of things. And I'm still yet to really play around with this with the Commodore 64, which is what this was originally designed for. So I'm looking forward to trying out the SideKick64 with an actual Commodore 64 to see what it can do. Keep in mind it doesn't emulate the VIC-2, so you're not going to get HDMI out of a C64 with this thing, but it does do a lot of other functions like freezer cartridges, loading programs, and RAM expansions. So I'm looking forward to testing it out with that. But I think that's enough for the VIC-20 for now. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. And if you really want to help out, you can become a Patreon with the links down in the video description. That'll also help the channel and allow me to keep making videos on little devices like this kind of thing. So yeah, please consider supporting the channel, and a huge thanks to the people that already support on Patreon. That's it for me. Bye.